The war on Syria has gone on for more than a decade, and yet it continues to drag on. Yet this is not just a civil war, which it's often mistakenly referred to as. Rather, this is an international war that has been fueled by multiple foreign countries from the very beginning, especially the United States and Israel. After violent protests broke out in Syria in 2011, the CIA began flooding the country with weapons and spending around $1 billion every single year arming and training so-called rebels to try to overthrow the Syrian government. And many of these rebels were linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Washington Post reported that the CIA program at $1 billion per year accounted for $1 out of every $15 in the CIA's overall budget, aimed at trying to destabilize Syria. The New York Times reported that this covert CIA program, known as Operation Timber Sycamore, was one of the largest CIA operations since the CIA Operation Cyclone in the 1980s in Afghanistan, in which the U.S. spy agency armed and trained Islamist extremists to try to fight against the socialist government in Afghanistan, which was supported by the Soviet Union. That war in the 1980s, in which the CIA funded and armed the Mujahideen, gave birth to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So these covert CIA initiatives, Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan in the 1980s and Operation Timber Sycamore in Syria in the 2010s, these were very similar operations in which the US government spent billions of dollars arming and training extremist Islamist groups trying to violently overthrow an independent secular government allied with Russia. There are very clear historical parallels. But the war in Syria is still not over. In 2016, the Syrian government was able to retake the city of Aleppo, which is the second biggest city in the country. It had previously been held by extremist groups allied with Al-Qaeda, and many of those groups fled to the west, to the northwestern Idlib province. And since 2016, Idlib has been governed by Rebranded Al-Qaeda. The main so-called rebel group in the region is called Hayat Tahrir Asham, HTS, which is the Rebranded Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. And in late November 2024, HTS, this Rebranded Al-Qaeda group, led an armed attack on Aleppo, the second biggest city in Syria after the capital Damascus. And these extremist groups took over Aleppo. Now, if you don't know much about the war in Syria and you only read Western media outlets, you'd probably be quite confused because Western media outlets refer to this group that took over Syria as rebels. They don't actually explain what HTS is. However, ironically, this armed group that is being cheered on in the Western media as rebels seeking freedom in Syria, this group, HTS, is officially recognized by the US government as a terrorist organization. The US government's National Counterterrorism Center has a website that provides information about these foreign terrorist organizations, and it notes that HTS evolved from Jabhat al-Nusra, or Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda's former branch in Syria. This was the largest branch of Al-Qaeda in world history, which had its base of operations in Syria and had gotten billions of dollars of weapons from the United States and its allies in the region. And in 2018, the US State Department added HTS to the Nusra Front's existing 2012 terrorist designation because, again, HTS is simply rebranded Al-Qaeda. They obviously could see that associating directly formally with Al-Qaeda was a bad look. So in order to try to win more international support, they said, oh, we're breaking ties formally with Al-Qaeda. But HTS still shares the same exact fascist ideology, genocidal ideology of Al-Qaeda. And the fact of the matter is that the US government has been allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria for more than 1 decade. If you don't believe me, listen to the current U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. Back during the Obama administration, Jake Sullivan was an aide to the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton. And thanks to WikiLeaks, which published Hillary Clinton's emails, we have a 2012 email that Jake Sullivan sent to his boss, the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, in which he said, quote, "AQ is on our side in Syria," end quote. AQ is, of course, Al-Qaeda. So this is the top aide to Hillary Clinton, U.S. Secretary of State, in 2012, admitting in an email published by the U.S. State Department that, quote, "Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria." So this has been going on for a decade. It's not a secret that the U.S. and Al-Qaeda have been on the same side against the Syrian government. And it has been widely reported for nearly a decade now that Al-Qaeda in Syria was using U.S. weapons. Reuters published an article in 2015 quoting the U.S. military that admitted that the CIA and the military had provided weapons to the so-called moderate rebels in Syria, and then those so-called rebels joined Al-Qaeda, or they gave their weapons to Al-Qaeda, their friends in Al-Qaeda, which at the time was called Jabhat al-Nusra and has since rebranded as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which controls Idlib and now took over Aleppo. This is rebranded Al-Qaeda. Where did they get their weapons from? They got their weapons from the U.S. military and the CIA. But it wasn't just the U.S. that was arming these extremist groups in Syria. It was also U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and, of course, Israel. And in 2019, the chief of the Israeli military, the IDF, publicly admitted that for years, Israel had been giving weapons to the extremist so-called rebels in Syria in order to try to overthrow the Syrian government. And of course, it wasn't just the US that was allied with Al-Qaeda, as Jake Sullivan, Biden's current national security advisor, admitted in 2012. Israel itself was also supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria. If you don't believe me, look up this 2015 article published in the major Israeli newspaper, the Jerusalem Post, which is titled, quote, "Israel treating Al-Qaeda fighters wounded in Syria civil war." So again, Israel was directly supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria. And this policy has continued ever since. In fact, on the 2nd of December of 2024, the major Israeli newspaper, The Times of Israel, published an article about how the extremist so-called rebels in Syria were thanking Israel for helping them carry out their war against the Syrian government. This is an article published in the Times of Israel titled, "Syria Rebels Appear to Credit Israeli Strikes on Hezbollah with Aiding Shock Advance." And it talks about how Israel's war of aggression against Lebanon and its attacks on the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah prevented Hezbollah from helping Syria, and it gave Al-Qaeda in Syria, in Idlib, the opportunity to cross over to take over Aleppo. And this article in the Times of Israel quotes multiple so-called opposition activists in Syria who are trying to overthrow the Syrian government. It quotes these extremists in both Aleppo and in Idlib. And I'm reading here from the Times of Israel. The rebels in Syria, quote, "thanked Jerusalem and said the opposition was very satisfied with Israel's actions against Hezbollah and other Iran-backed players." The Syrian rebels told the Israeli media, quote, "They accuse us of cooperating with you because we were quite happy when you attacked Hezbollah, really happy, and we're glad that you won." And they said, quote, "We love Israel and we were never its enemies." This is an opposition activist from Idlib, Al-Qaeda-controlled Syrian territory. And he said, quote, "We don't hate you, we love you very much," end quote. So this is an opposition leader from Syria telling the Israeli media, "We love you, we love Israel." And by the way, what's funny is this article in the Times of Israel admits that the new insurgency in Aleppo has been led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. So they admit that Al-Qaeda, so-called activists, so-called rebels, are praising Israel and saying to Israel, "We love you." Now, there's one other part of this article that just really lets the cat out of the bag and admits what the Syrian opposition's goal is. A so-called rebel commander who spoke with the Israeli media said that their goal was to overthrow the Syrian government led by President Bashar al-Assad and set up a new government that has good relations with Israel. He emphasized in an interview with Israel's Channel 12, this so-called rebel commander allied with Al-Qaeda, he said that they want to create a new government that has good relations with Israel. And he said, quote, "We call on the Israeli leadership to launch intensive attacks against the positions and troops of the Iran-backed militias in Syrian territory," end quote. So this is the real face of the so-called rebels in Syria. They are sectarian extremist fundamentalists that want to ethnically cleanse religious minorities and enslave women. And they are thanking Israel and telling Israel, "Help us more, give us more support, keep bombing Syria and Hezbollah and Iran, and help us to create a new government in Syria, and we will be friends with you." Of course, I should say that the current government of Syria, led by President Bashar al-Assad, has no diplomatic relations with Israel and has strongly supported Palestine and has provided weapons to resistance groups fighting against the genocidal Israeli colonial regime that is committing genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza. And this is very clearly one of the main reasons for the US-led international war against Syria. This was also revealed in an article in Reuters published on the 2nd of December titled, "US-UAE discussed lifting Assad sanctions in exchange for break with Iran." Now, for context, I should say that Syria is suffering under brutal unilateral sanctions, which are illegal under international law, which have been imposed by the US and Europe to try to suffocate the Syrian economy. This has caused horrific levels of inflation and food shortages and oil shortages in Syria. So the people of Syria are being collectively punished and terrorized by the West in this economic war against their country. So as the US has this medieval siege on Syria, it is trying to pressure Damascus. And in order to lift the sanctions, what is the United States demanding? According to Reuters, the US and the UAE have demanded that Syria cut its ties with Iran and cut off weapon routes to Hezbollah. So break their alliance with Iran and stop supporting Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance against Israeli colonialism as Israel is invading and bombing Lebanon. And by the way, I should point out that there were these misleading reports claiming that Israel signed a so-called ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's not a real ceasefire. It was a marketing strategy. It was public relations. As even CNN reported, the United Nations peacekeeping force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, UNIFIL, said that Israel has breached its ceasefire agreement with Lebanon 100 times since the truce went into effect a week ago. That is to say, after Israel signed this fake so-called ceasefire, in the next week, it violated that ceasefire 100 times, according to the UN. And meanwhile, the US military has also been carrying out airstrikes in Syria, bombing targets in Syria that the Pentagon claims are linked to Iran. So this is what is actually happening here. The US and Israel are trying to divide the axis of resistance. These are the resistance groups in the so-called Middle East in West Asia that are in alliance with each other. In Iran, in Iraq, there are multiple resistance groups. The Syrian government and its allies. In Lebanon, you have the indigenous resistance group Hezbollah, which emerged out of Israel's illegal military occupation of South Lebanon in the 1980s. And then, of course, the Palestinian resistance groups. Together, these anti-colonial resistance groups that are national liberation organizations fighting for the independence of their countries and their peoples against Western colonialism and Israeli colonialism sponsored by the West. These groups in the axis of resistance are unified, and the US and Israel are trying to divide them, to divide and conquer, to break them apart. So the US is telling Syria, okay, we know we are suffocating you with sanctions. We are suffocating the Syrian people. If you want us to lift those sanctions, you have to cut off your ties to Iran and end support for Hezbollah, which would be causing a major fracturing of the axis of resistance. All of this is about maintaining US hegemonic control over West Asia. This is one of the most geostrategic regions on Earth. Half of the world's top 10 largest oil and gas producers are located in this region. There are multiple trade choke points located in this region through which every single day millions of barrels of oil pass, including the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf that Saudi Arabia uses to export its oil, including the Bab al-Mandab Strait off the southern coast of Yemen, where millions of barrels of oil pass through every day, and then, of course, including the Suez Canal, overseen by Egypt, which is also one of the most important trading routes on Earth. Israel is a big military outpost for the US empire, which it uses to project power across the region. This is why the former US Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, said, quote, Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk, end quote. This is also why back in 2017, Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, proudly referred to Israel as a mighty aircraft carrier of the United States. And I should point out that Netanyahu is an American. He had U.S. citizenship not once, but twice. Netanyahu spent his most formative years growing up in the United States, going to high school and college, and initially working in the United States. He is an American, and as the longest ever serving leader of Israel, he has publicly said, we are a mighty U.S. aircraft carrier in one of the most strategic regions on Earth. And by the way, it was also U.S. President Joe Biden who has repeatedly said for decades that Israel is so important for the strategic interests of the U.S. empire to maintain a chokehold over this strategic region that if Israel did not exist, the United States would have to create it.
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one. I've long said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it.
The United States has used Israel for decades to wage a brutal war against all of the anti-imperialist resistance forces in the Middle East, in West Asia. So first, it targeted communist groups, especially in Palestine, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, and other communist and socialist groups that were allied with the former Soviet Union. Also, it went after Arab nationalist groups, left-wing Arab nationalists like Nasser in Egypt or in Syria or in Iraq. You had Arab nationalist groups that were also mostly allied with the former Soviet Union and with Russia today. Israel was used by the US to try to crush all of these resistance groups in the region. And then in the 80s and 90s, you had the rise of some Islamic nationalist groups like Hezbollah that emerged in response to Israel's illegal occupation of Lebanese territory, or in Palestine, you had similar groups that emerged, and Israel has been waging a war against these groups, helping the US try to maintain its hegemonic control over this very important region. And Syria, along with Iran, is one of the only countries that has actually provided support, tangible material support, and weapons to these resistance groups in Palestine, in Lebanon, fighting for their own liberation against Western colonialism. And this is why the US government has spent billions of dollars over a decade arming and training these so-called rebels who are allied with Al-Qaeda. As the Washington Post reported in 2015, here's a headline. US-trained fighters in Syria gave equipment to Al-Qaeda affiliate. And it wasn't just Al-Qaeda, it was also ISIS. Here's an article from CNN in 2015 titled Amnesty Report, ISIS Armed with US Weapons. The same thing happened with ISIS, which grew out of Al-Qaeda. The US flooded the region with weapons, and those weapons went to ISIS. Here's an article from Al Jazeera in 2017 titled ISIL Weapons Traced to US and Saudi Arabia. Arms used by ISIL in battle were supplied by the US and Saudi Arabia to Syrian opposition fighters. Of course, ISIL is another name for ISIS because the term in Arabic is Asham, which means Levant, so you can translate it as either S or L. And this is also a funny article because Al Jazeera is the state media of Qatar, and Qatar, another Persian Gulf monarchy like Saudi Arabia, was funding also these extremist groups in Syria, including Al-Qaeda. Now, if you don't believe me about this, listen to the words of US President Joe Biden. Back when he was vice president in the Obama administration, he gave a speech at Harvard University where he spilled the beans and he admitted that US allies like Turkey and the Persian Gulf monarchies were flooding the region with weapons to try to overthrow the Syrian government, and those weapons were going to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, keep in mind here, of course, that Biden is trying to say, oh, we had nothing to do with it. The United States didn't support this policy. It was our allies like Turkey and the Gulf monarchies. But US allies would not have done this without the approval of the United States. So the CIA and the Pentagon were encouraging their allies to do this. So this is very much something that the US bears responsibility for. Keep that in mind as you listen to this very frank admission by Joe Biden back when he was significantly more lucid than he has been recently.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now, you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them. So what happened? Now all of a sudden, I don't want to be too facetious, but they have seen the Lord. And there were a couple former members of the administration who are arguing we should give, quote, the opposition, which we couldn't identify as moderate, by the way, I'm serious about that, give them ground-to-air launch missiles. Can you imagine what would have happened if that had been done? Does anybody doubt they would have been in the hands of al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda or Khorasan Group or ISIL?
And this brings me to one of the most important bombshell pieces of evidence, which is a declassified document published by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, back in 2012. This was a classified cable that was published by the DIA, and it was sent to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, the FBI, the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State. This is an incredible document that admits that from the very beginning, the U.S. military knew that ISIS and Al-Qaeda were driving the opposition in Syria and the so-called Syrian revolution, as the Western media put it. I'm reading here from the US DIA in 2012, just 1 year into the Syrian proxy war. This memo says, quote, "The Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. The West, Gulf countries, and Turkey support the opposition, while Russia, China, and Iran support the regime." So this is an incredible admission. From 2012, right at the beginning of the Syria war, the Pentagon knew that they were not so-called moderate rebels who were leading this war. They were Salafists. That means Salafi-jihadist, extremists like Al-Qaeda. And then they say that the Muslim Brotherhood and AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, were the main forces in Syria. The DIA document also says, quote, "AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, supported the Syrian opposition from the beginning." From the very beginning. This is a very revealing document. And this document also points out that these extremist groups, they saw the Syrian government as an infidel regime because the government is led by Bashar al-Assad, whose family are Alawite Muslims, which is a Shia branch of Islam. And these extremists in Syria also saw the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah as a so-called infidel party because Hezbollah is led by Shia Muslims, even though they have collaborated with Sunni Muslims in Palestine, but these extremists see them as infidels because they're Shia. Now, this 2012 DIA document admits that the war in Syria was becoming a proxy war. So the Pentagon has known from the very beginning, this is not a civil war, this is a proxy war fueled by the West. Now, one of the most incredible admissions in this document, which is why it's a bombshell, is that back in 2012, the DIA document warned of, quote, "the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria," and they named as regions Deir ez-Zor, which was taken over by ISIS. And this cable said, quote, "This is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want." So they knew in 2012, the US DIA, the US military intelligence knew in 2012 that ISIS and Al-Qaeda were leading the so-called opposition in Syria, and they were probably going to create a so-called Salafist principality, that is a caliphate, in Deir ez-Zor, in eastern Syria, and in Mosul, in western Iraq, which is exactly what happened. Those were the centers of ISIS's so-called caliphate. And by the way, later on in this same DIA cable, they admit that ISIS had already emerged, the Islamic State in Iraq, which later went into Syria and became ISIS or ISIL. And this 2012 document says that the Islamic State in Iraq, ISI, could also declare an Islamic State through its union with other terrorist organizations in Iraq and Syria. They then added that this would draw terrorist elements from all over the Arab world who would enter into Iraq and then later Syria. So the US knew from the very beginning what it was doing. It knew that by flooding Syria with weapons and arming and training these so-called rebels, that they would end up empowering Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but they ended up doing it because they were trying to overthrow the Syrian government and divide the axis of resistance to crush all anti-colonial resistance forces in the region so the US could dominate this very important strategic region. Back in 2016, I published an article at Salon that looked at a very revealing document published by a prominent Israeli think tank that does contracting work for NATO and the Israeli government. And this policy paper, this Israeli think tank, said that the West should not destroy ISIS because they called ISIS a useful tool against Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria. Here I am looking at the paper published in 2016 by the Israeli think tank, the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. It is titled, "The Destruction of Islamic State is a Strategic Mistake." This article admitted that ISIS was a genocidal, brutal group, but it still argued that, quote, "the Western distaste for Islamic State brutality and immorality should not obfuscate strategic clarity," end quote. And they said that even if this group is genocidal, quote, "it is useful and even moral," end quote, "to allow ISIS to continue attacking Syria, Russia, Hezbollah, and Iran." And this article in this Israeli think tank backed by NATO, they said, quote, "stability is not a value in and of itself." So they're saying that we don't want the region to be stable if it means that it would actually hurt US and Israeli imperial interests. Instead, they said, quote, "instability and crises sometimes contain portents of positive change," end quote. So they're saying that we want instability in Syria because it helps the US and Israel and hurts our adversaries. And then the final money quote of this paper is, quote, "Islamic State can be a useful tool in undermining Tehran." So this was the US-Israeli strategy, also with support from Turkey and support from the Gulf regimes. For years, they have supported extremist groups in Syria allied with Al-Qaeda in an attempt to try to overthrow the Syrian government, to break up the axis of resistance, to divide the anti-colonial opposition in the region, and to maintain US hegemonic domination over one of the most strategic regions of the world. And this is exactly what we're seeing again going on in Syria. This war has not ended, and we really need to study what has happened in the past decade to understand what is happening today. But unfortunately, you have to do a lot of research in order to understand that context. That is why I created Geopolitical Economy Report to help to provide this very important information to people. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.